We are honored today to have as our featured speaker Johanna Drucker, and you'll notice in the program her name is misspelled. So some of you may not have noticed that, but it's Johanna. I've already apologized. She is a woman with deep interests, warm connection, and concerns that intersect with media ecology. She is currently the Martin and Bernard Breslauer Professor in the Department of Information Studies at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. That's a mouthful. She earned her BFA from the California College of Arts and Crafts in 1973, her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1986. She was previously the Robertson Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia and has been in a number of different positions across the country. She is a prolific writer. In fact, when I asked her what her interests were, it was writing books. So she has no writer's block, I think. She writes on topics such as the rhetoric of visual representation, cubism, the history of the alphabet, the structure, form, and conceptualization of 20th century art, the books as a metaphor, artificial intelligence, and on and on. Her interests keep expanding. Ms. Drucker connects digital humanities, media studies, and graphic design history. Other people have described her as sweet, charming, interesting, deeply skeptical, and controversial, all in one person. She says that the end of knowledge is the beginning of ignorance. Please join me in welcoming Johanna Drucker.
So I'm actually trying to celebrate the ignorance part of that rather than the knowledge part. And I just want to thank you all. It's been really fun to be here for the last day and to be exposed to and immersed in what I think of as both a kind of telos and ethos of your community, and to begin to see, what the worldview is that you are working with. So I'm hoping that I can make some comments that won't seem completely heretical, but probably partly so, and also get something out for you that might be of interest, given the conversations I've been listening to. And I, where I'm coming from for this project. By the way, a number of people pointed out to me that I have misspelled Jacques Ellul on here. Okay. It's a good place to start. All right. The transformative power of bad orthography. The route to enlightenment is through mistakes. And needless to say, it's not an error. So we all know that media are media are social. And I don't think anybody would argue with that concept, and certainly nobody in this room would argue with the idea that media are social, they're embedded in culture, they're modified. Every aspect of the technology of media is modified by the way in which the behaviors, the values, the transactions they're involved with really, qualify the technological identity of a medium. So we know that media are not simply technical, they're not simply technological instruments. They're very much part of a social world, okay? And they're situated in that social world. And we also know that techno-deterministic notions have long been banished from our critical theoretical thinking. So those are not straw men I have to set up or get rid of in this situation. So what I'd like to do instead is address a question that's been on my mind for a while, and that is to ask the question, how can we fully conceptualize something else? How can we fully conceptualize what media are, and at the same time look at the terms on which we assume their identity and theorize their function by shifting our understanding to the question of how we understand the social as a medium? So how do we understand the social as a medium? Now, first of all, I have to apologize for the extremely annoying gesture of taking an adjective and turning it into a substantive noun. It's a really repulsive feature of academic discourse. And I'm going to do it twice in this lecture. The social and the diagrammatic are both going to emerge as terms. But the reason I'm doing that is because I do want to make an attempt to see if we can understand how to constitute what appears to be a kind of ineffable, an intractable field itself as a medium. to think of the social as the medium in which actions, transactions, and occurrences all register as significant, where the term significant carries the whole sort of legacy of Peircean semiotics and signification and so forth. So that's my agenda here, but I'm going to get there through a kind of circuitous route. Well, actually, I think it's a direct route, but it's a somewhat oblique route. I'm going to do it by talking about diagrams and Walter Ong's work, Raymond Lull's work, and also a kind of take a detour through an anecdote of a recent social event, highly mediated, and then come back to some conclusions. There's a lot of approaches that we could take for undertaking this task of theorizing the social domain as a medium. So, as I said, I'm going to do it by looking at diagrams as mediating figures. And the reason I want to do that is I actually think that we can talk about diagrams and the diagrammatic, again, that awkward substantive, as abstract schemes that present us with models of mediation. So if we want to think about how do we understand mediation, the diagrammatic forms allow us to look at these structurally in a kind of meta way. So I'm going to begin my discussion then with something that will be quite familiar to you, and that is Walter Ong's engagement with Petrus Ramus. Then I want to put the work of Raymond Lull into contrast with it in a kind of retro step, which I'm going to argue is actually a progressive step, that Lull is not less than Ramus, not antecedent to Ramus, and not inferior to Ramus, but has something to offer to us. And then I want to, as I said, introduce an anecdotal account of a recent event that calls for a very different analysis and presentation of mediation. And I'm going to offer you another diagrammatic form in the context of that discussion. So by doing this, I really hope to show how our understanding of media can be extended can really be extended, like how do we understand media, by this engagement with the concept of the social as a crucial aspect of our model of mediation. I'm hoping it won't all stay on that level of abstraction, but that's the basic theoretical framework. So to do this, I'm going to make a reductive, but I hope suggestive reading of 3 different modes of diagrammatic activity, each of which functions as a condensation of theoretical formulations of knowledge in media. The first of these is what I'm going to call a declarative instrumental mode. The second is a contemplative and provocative mode. And finally, I want to talk about a stochastic generative and emergent mode. And I want to suggest that when we think about media, we might even say think media as a better construct here, as when we think media as instrumental, as able to operationalize knowledge, I would say we close off the possibility of a concept in which mediating processes, not media things, is foregrounded. So I want to start with Ong, and of course those of you who know this image know that it is an image of the Porphyrian tree being chopped down, right, which is a wonderful image of the sort of end of scholasticism. All right, but we'll get back to the trees in a moment. I want to start with Ong for a couple of reasons. First of all, Ong is obviously an important figure here. It was very important to me in my work. I read Ong early in my graduate career and was highly influenced by his work, but also because of his importance to media theory. Now, I think it's also useful to remember that, and again, I'm not reminding anybody here of this, you all know it, but to remind us that his work on media theory occurs in the context of concerns about the structure of literary texts and the way their composition seems to indicate their production within certain conditions of literacy and orality. We're reminded, for instance, that he's building on the work of Milman Parry and Eric Havelock and other scholars of classical literature. And again, it's important to remember that particular reference frame, for whom the question of authorship and authority of the Homeric texts was central to their scholarship. And that really defines, in many ways, the kind of horizon of their inquiry, and I think sometimes to the detriment of conceiving of orality-literacy relations somewhat differently. That's part of my heresy. It'll come back. Anyway, the thinking that was formulated in that context is heavily dependent on classicism as a crucial contribution to Western literature. And again, the question of what defines Western literature is one that we could debate very profitably, I think. Western literature and thought. Now, Ong has a progressive narrative, right, of orality to literacy. That has been qualified quite a bit subsequently, and again, most recently in the work of postcolonial theorists. And here I think of Robert Fraser, the book Through Postcolonial Eyes, and Walter Mignolo, whose charge, Mignolo's charge to decolonize knowledge, requires really undoing a lot of the oppositions that were reified in Ong's work, as well as the work of Jack Goody, Ian Watt, and others. But I'm not going to talk about literacy and orality, having introduced those little provocations at the beginning. We can take them up. But my reference to Ong is really going to be on the work of the 16th century scholar Petrus Ramus, and to Ong's analysis of Ramus's method. Now, again, remember who Ramus is and why Ramus is so important to Ong. And also, I think it's so telling that Ong takes up Ramus when McLuhan says to him, don't work on Hopkins, work on Ramus. And that's such an important thing to remember in terms of how Ong thinks, right? And he, of course, comes back to Hopkins later. So here's Ramus instead, a powerful intellectual figure for symbolizing, in an emblematic sense, a transformation. So we'll let that periphery intrigue go away for a moment. We'll come back to others. All right, so why is Ramus so important to Ong? I'm going to summarize this very briefly because, again, it's familiar territory. So for Ong, Ramus is the figure who emblematically embodies and demonstrates the shift from scholastic rhetoric to humanistic reason, right? So Ong is going to celebrate Ramus on the assumption, it's not an assumption I share, I'm sorry to tell you, on the assumption that reason is triumphant, that it is the demonstration of the capacity of mind to model the order of the world in its own image and vice versa, and give embodied expression to that order of thought in an ordered form and mediating structure. So here we have Ramus, right? Here we have these beautiful diagrammatic expressions of Ramus's method. Now, Ramus's method is reason instrumentalized and operationalized. And again, Ong celebrates this, right? And it's present in the form and format of diagrammatic thought, in which difference and discreteness are the systematic principles of a rational epistemology. All right, so, there's plenty of reason for Ong to believe in this and to celebrate it and to analyze Ramus in this way. And I don't disagree with that. I simply have a point of difference with what the end point of our understanding of knowledge and media might be. So Ong's enthusiasm for Ramus mapped onto the conviction, here a media analysis, that the printed book, remember the second half of that book on Ramus is about the printed book and its role in Ramus's thought and in the reification of it and distribution of it, mapped onto the conviction that the printed book, in its fixed structuring of place, of topoi, the topology of argument, functioned as a rational instrument in ways that the fluid structure of medieval manuscripts did not. Okay, so he's celebrating also the technology of the printed book as a rational space. Now, again, this isn't the place to argue all of the nuances, complexities, inaccuracies, historical details of this point. I mean, there are many, many things to say on this. I've said them in other contexts, happy to take that up later as well, another act of heresy here. Instead, let's take Ong's discussion of Ramus on its own terms. Okay, let's accept what Ong has to say about Ramus, and let's take Ramus's images as embodying the order of reason as an explanation of the order of the world, right? They are rational diagrams. So if we accept that, and I'm happy to accept that is Ong's argument, the diagrams, and this is a crucial point, the diagrams in Ramus's method are fundamentally declarative. Their mode of expression is declarative. They state what is, and they do it in analogy with their structure, and they assert their ability to present that order, that rational order, that relationship of knowledge and the world. So very, very interesting to think about Ramus in this way, right? And Ong leads us to that place. So I want to contrast Ramus then with Raymond Lull. And before I do that, I want to simply mention that the diagrammatic imagination of the late medieval period is shot through with, the kind of tree structures, the hierarchies that Ramus then puts to the service of method, but they don't always serve the purpose of method. And the diagrammatic imagination of Flood, of Kircher, and others are really interesting to look at because of the moment of their flowering. Again, and here print culture has a great role to play in the dissemination of these standardized forms. So they're rigid, they're hierarchical, they're cosmological, they're medieval in their worldview. And the diagram is very much a medieval form. The fact that it gets put at the service of Enlightenment thought and reason has to do with its kind of shift of phase, context, and use. What's interesting is to see how far Ramos's diagrammatic forms go in informing the structures of Enlightenment knowledge and reason as we go forward. And here I show you Bishop John Wilkins is wonderful towards a real character in philosophical grammar or philosophical language from 1666 or 1668, in which Wilkins is borrowing heavily from Ramus as the encyclopedists do and so forth going forward. So again, a strong imprint on rational thought from Ramus going ahead. But we mustn't forget that there are other diagrammatic forms equally powerful. And one of the things that's so striking, actually, in Kircher, who's pictured here on the right, is that this is from the Ars Siendi Magna, is that Kircher is a Lullian. He is a Lullian through and through, and all of Ars Siendi is based on Lull. And that's also interesting when you realize that that book is published at exactly the same time as Wilkins's real character. All right, so this is, these two worldviews are completely coexisting at this time. So my attempt now is going to be to look at Lull for a moment and try to convince you that Lull is not the retro figure who is eclipsed by Ramus, but that Lull has something else to offer to us if we reread Lull slightly differently. All right, if we reread Lull's diagrams in a hermeneutic way, within the context of their use and the kind of intellectual intention that he had for them. So Lull is a 13th century Kabbalist, right? And Lull's work is often read in relation to that of Leibniz, because Leibniz will claim him later, right? Leibniz loves Lull. And contemporary historians of computation love to have that lineage. They see Lull's Vauwels. Now, these are Lull's trees, but as we know, Lull's going to get rid of his trees, and he's going to go to the Vauwels. So, the trees are too static, in spite of the fact that the Sephirotic tree is a contemplative instrument, right? It is not a representation. It is meant for meditation. All right, Lull is going to go from the tree structure to the Vauwel structure for his Ars Brevis and his Ars Magnus, which are the two cornerstones of his work. So, again, I'm going to assume that you know Lull and you know what he does, but essentially what he's doing here is setting up a combinatoric system in which the attributes of God can be meditated upon through a continual rotation of the combinations produced through these inner circles and outer circles. And it's much more complicated than that. But the point is that that these Vauwels are often seen, again, in this lineage of Lull to Leibniz, where Leibniz's Ars Combinatoria is seen as the kind of antecedent to computational activity, that Lull's Vauwels are seen as calculating machines, as things that are used for a form of computation. Now, I would suggest that these are not about a computational approach to knowledge, that that's a complete misreading of Lull's work, that he is not a predecessor to George Boole and the laws of thought. He is not a sort of, antecedent to Cartesian mathesis, and he is not doing a model of fully rational thought. I think that misses the point of Lull's work. I think it's richer than that. I'm not a Kabbalist, so I'm not promoting Kabbalism particularly, though some aspects of it might still be useful. I would suggest instead that the objection I'm making here is that the reason we should not see these as computational is they're not going to be used for the calculation of final, fixed, or unambiguous knowledge. They're not about getting fixed results. They are not instruments of reason or rational work. They don't stand in a representational relationship to mind and world as knowledge. They are instead, right, contemplative instruments. And this is really important. Lull is interested in questions of faith. And questions of faith for Lull have to be dynamic. They have to be alive. They cannot be fixed, and they cannot be final, because the engagement with God is not final. It is always ongoing in Lull's belief system. So this, I think, is a very different way to think about the mediating apparatus of the Vauwels. They are there as provocations to contemplation and to engagement with with a relationship with God, right? And this is Lull's world. This is Lull's belief system. All right, so Lull, the Kabbalist, I would suggest, is making generative diagrams, not declarative ones. And I would make that distinction, that where Ramus is using a declarative mode, Lull is using a generative mode, and that these two things are radically different in their mediating functions and in their relationship to the production of knowledge. Lull's notion of knowledge is that it is situated relationally within an individual. It's interpolated into a subject who is thinking and working. It is not outside of the subject, right? It's a very different hermeneutic construct. So, for Ong, however, Ramus's embodiment of reason, of ratio, of method is a summa. It's an endpoint. Where can you go beyond reason? Reason is what we rely on. Reason is the enlightenment. Reason is the explanation of all things. All right, and this is where I differ with Ong. Beyond the reconciliation of method and order with the order of the world and the alignment of reason with belief and faith, where do we go? So for me, reason, like the physics of Newton, only explains certain aspects of the operation of the world. It's not wrong, it's simply insufficient. The laws of physics only obtain within certain scales of experience and phenomena. We know that. The quantum worlds, the phenomena of relativity, can't be explained by its frameworks, any more than the operations of the social world can be subsumed within the mechanistic principles of instrumental or operationalized knowledge. And that, to me, is crucial. We cannot subsume the operations of the social world within the mechanistic principles of instrumental or operationalized knowledge. So when we think about media and mediation, again, empirical methods are useful, rational methods are useful, analytic methods are useful, quantitative and qualitative methods are useful, but what is sufficient to explain this? And that's the question I'm trying to push us towards an engagement with. So if we subject Ong's analysis to a post-Cartesian analysis, right, plenty of post-Cartesian thought around, there has been for a century, reason is suddenly seen as a binaristic model, right? It bifurcates the world between mind and body, between subject and object, between being and thinking. So in a post-Cartesian framework, those oppositions do not hold. They're fundamentally flawed in terms of the very ontology of being, what being is. So informed by a new materialist, speculative realist, complex systems approach, the notion of codependencies, what Karen Barad, the physicist, philosopher, calls intra-action, emergent contingencies, we start to move towards a stochastic process as a basic understanding of mediating systems. And foremost among these mediating systems, I would suggest, is the social. What is the social as a mediating system? Right? What is happening in this space? What is going on in this room? Right? The social, I suggest, is the primary medium. And within it, the aspects and the facets and the features and the components of activity, of transactions, of exchanges, all those things take place in a way that can be shown diagrammatically in models of stochastic activity. So here I'm going to break off and change discourse modes. Oh, I wanted to mention squares of opposition within my Lullian construct of the generative. And again, to say that the history of generative diagrams is long and diverse, but that the squares of opposition, as they come out of, again, classical philosophy, are extremely useful. Again, they are not representations of fact or of information or of order. They are instruments for intellection. They're instruments of thought. Okay, so having set up this framework, I'm now going to break off and tell you a story. I'm going to read an anecdote. I'm going to read it in a novelistic way about an event that I recently was part of and watched take place. Some of you will know the event and the context. For others, it'll be unfamiliar. I'm going to assume unfamiliarity and read the story as if you've never heard it before. I'll read about 10 minutes of this, and then I'll return to my conclusions and open the floor for discussion. How does an event unfolding, demonstrate the principle not only that all media are social, but that the social itself is a medium? From its initial occurrence, the event I'm going to describe here was mediated through many complexities of social exchange. Only some of these mediations leave a trace. Only some of them leave a trace in communications, records, and documents. The rest are merely traced in exchanges, glances, looks, word and body language that vanish from view immediately but constitute an initial field of event space. It's a Friday afternoon in March in Providence, Rhode Island, and a digital literary studies conference is underway at Brown University. The first morning has that deep hush feeling that comes into an auditorium before sufficient social exchange has created a web of understanding. The individuals in the room are somewhat atomized, in spite of a reception the night before in the gallery. The cast of morning characters hasn't yet organized into clusters, nodes, or eddies of conversational exchange or sympathies. That will come. As the tone of the conference begins to become apparent in the comments and presentations, alliances will form. The predictable and also unexpected lines of tension and antagonism, support and empathy. This is the social. A medium so complicated in its energies and dynamics that it's always in play, it's always moving, shifting, changing. Imagine mapping it as a heat map, in which the thermal temperature of the scene can be analyzed at every level, from the nanoscale to the macro, across any number of constantly shifting differentials, the perceived and the actual, the imagined and the intended, the incidental and the deliberate, right, and so on. Any filter applicable to human behavior and perception can be used to generate an analytic vector, a metric of critical study, and yet these will always be, as in any conditional circumstance, both an element of and an intervention in the very system they examine. So, the novelist says, an air of latent expectancy, still unstirred by any particular acts or individuals, lies like a morning fog in and among the ranged rows of chairs in the auditorium. As the participants filter in the dull sounds of upholstered seats dropping, bags and coats being shifted about, laptops opening with their wake-up sounds, all populate the lower regions of the space like air bubbles popping on the surface of a lazy pond in a vast cavern, and they have little or no effect on the upper atmosphere. What is the medium? No material substrate holds the trace, no record or document is being made. Or is it, and simply not being seen, not quite perceptible? The individual and collective inscriptions of memory and experience, ephemeral and imprinted, neural patterns and synapse firings, and the space of shared experience are not contained in any individual, but they're made in the very actions of exchange in common space, in coincident temporality. Human clock speeds are as varied as those of our electronics, and each of us runs according to our own pace, slower or faster as occasion demands. But for some moments, hours, days, an external framework defines the program through which we move and in which we measure where we are in the event and the events which unfold. And there will be consensus and dissent, contrasting currents that pull and push against each other. Agreement and disagreement will begin to surface. And a set of questions posed in an interruption breaks the mood of conviviality. It's confrontational. The voice presses issues of war, of race, of struggle to the fore. The speaker is known, and his rants are a long-standing feature of such events, but also his remarks are generic, easily bracketed. They're the standard liberal guilt statements that break into aesthetic venues as if to claim some higher moral ground. And this will come back later as the main event of the day explodes the decorum of the assembly. And what is that main event of the day? And here you see pictured Kenneth Goldsmith, who did a reading at this Interrupt event at Brown University in March. And this then is the event that explodes. When Kenny gets up, he searches through a browser, and I've deliberately cropped this image to not show the image that he showed. He searches through a browser, visibly, publicly, until he finds a picture of Michael Brown, the recently killed teenager from Ferguson, Missouri. So we've watched him do the search engine, the Google clicking. After clicking through a few images, he picks the high school graduation photo with Brown in cap and gown, and the image settles onto the screen. Kenny's ready. He goes to the microphone, center stage. The performance has begun. It started through the day by his studied absence in the group from which he held himself apart. He was present but not speaking. And the apartness is part of what he wears as he goes onto the stage. He's not of us, just among us. And to begin, he says something that cites a remark from earlier in the day about the quantified self, stating he's about to contribute an instance of this phenomenon. And so he reads. His voice inflects, his body nods and sways. This is a performance in the a performance in the manner of a poetic performance. The text is the autopsy report of Michael Brown. The description of wounds is explicit, of the condition of the flesh, the internal organs, the abdomen, the developed and as yet undeveloped features of anatomy, every physical detail of the young body destroyed by bullet wounds. We listen. The audience doesn't move. Focus is complete. He occupies the stage in the light, in the center of the light. The audience has been attentive all day. Its attention has been honed and practiced. It's brought into alignment. He is the provocateur, and that is his slot in the program, so named. In the space of the room, the complicatedly aimed attention, cell phone recordings, photos, and tweets are already penetrating the shell of the auditorium, and this is one of the pieces of evidence of that. This is a social media photograph. The early tweeting of the day suddenly becomes mere amusement, distraction, a report of an event of interest to a few, and now the event is of interest to many. Kenny's a celebrity. He's a figure, a public figure, at a level beyond that of anybody else in the room by a factor of something. What, 5, 10? No one else has been on Colbert. No one else has been invited to the White House, had dinner with Yoko Ono. These are serious celebrity credentials. They speak volumes about visibility, about the scale of networks to which he belongs and in which he is a player. Publicity more than poetics is his medium, and that is hardly news to any of us present. And the fact that aesthetic activity bears no other price and requires no other entry besides daring, creative practice, and whatever is reaped in return makes it the ideal arena for celebrity work, for the work of making and being a celebrity. But the world consumes him through its media, and he has created a media life, an image, and a persona. And does he care what he does beyond the publicity effect? It's hard to say. But in this instance, the immediate effect is complex. We are immersed. The language of the report is becoming familiar. We are immersed in it. The experience is chilling, off-putting, annoying, upsetting, intense, moving. Chilling because of the clinical distance of the language, off-putting because it's not clear that this is a text to be appropriated in this way, annoying because it feels like a publicity stunt, upsetting because of what it tells us about the world in which we live now, intense because the emotional response in the room is palpable. Something has happened. Much has happened. Each individual processing the reading has been forced to decide how they feel. There's no ignoring the content, the form, the gesture, the performance, the appropriation, and also the manipulation. The text has been changed, it's been altered, it's been turned into a poetic text, even as it's meant to stand as an unmanipulated text, to be the thing in itself that is so starkly challenging to the crafted works and conceits of literature. The shift in mediation cycles is a matter of degree, not kind, and response to the event is filtered through the skepticism that whiffs through the air of the auditorium, even as the raptness with which the room attends to the speaker begins to be riddled by small boreholes of doubt, question, and other response that introduces distance, even hostility, between speaker and audience. We are starting to come and go from the performance and the text, with awareness of the performance dimensions coming into play. And as the event begins as his reading starts to end, the question of the act begins to be felt as a collective question. How do we read the situation? How do we know what's being done? The room fills with response as Kenny ends, with questions. It's tense. There are redolent waves of intellection and emotion intermingling, canceling, quarreling, struggling with each other in ways that are expressed and articulated once the commentary and discussion begin. Many things are happening simultaneously. Everyone present is processing, revisiting the very frames and criteria by which aesthetic experience is assessed. What has just happened? Events. As the room's energy fragments, turning into eddies of reaction, small pockets of support, rejection, engagement, the moods shift with volatility and speed. And the instability of the atmosphere is true in its average as well as in its individual locations, and no single metric can obtain. Everything is erratic, unpredictable, spinning and spiking, and the rate of exchanges moving out into the networked social world is escalating rapidly. How do we model that event? What is that event space? Is it sufficient to take a diagram of social networks, to look at social mediation, the world of social media, and say that this provides a map of what occurs? I would suggest no, and that here again I go back to, if the social is a medium, then the diagrammatic form that we need to describe it is stochastic. Let me reiterate that what I am suggesting is not simply that the social is inscribed in media and traces, or only, though that's important, that it provides a context of use, as if media are separate from the context, but instead that the social itself be understood as a medium. Media effects are not operationalized and through instrumental means, as if a mechanistic operation of effects can be measured, empirically observed, cataloged, or inventoried from an observer-independent position. Instead, the mediating activities of the social are the fundamental emergent systems of production of knowledge, of culture, of events, including values, consensus, assent, and dissent. So again, I show you an image of a hurricane because the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere is the place in which the most sophisticated diagrams of stochastic processes are being produced. So we could easily call this Hurricane Kenny rather than Hurricane Mitch in terms of what transacted within the social media. And again, I would say the contrast between this and this is really, really important because the nature of the atmosphere is not the same as a set of nodes and edges. It's far, far more complicated and far more of a complete system. It's not a matter of things in a system. It is the system. So in conclusion, then, let me say that instead, what I'm trying to say here is that what I'm trying to do is to contrast these three different modes of mediating knowledge and mediating systems, starting from the idea that one notion is the one mode, and again, these don't cancel each other out, they all coexist, from the declarative and instrumental reason of Ramus, which stands in a representational relationship to knowledge, to the contemplative and generative operations of Lull, the provocative, the engaged, the interpolated subject, and then finally to the stochastic or emergent mediating conditions of the present model. Again, the system is the event. The diagrammatic serves as a way to see and to show and model these concepts as constructs of media, as social, and of the social as a medium. And I'll stop there and see what kinds of questions you might have or discussion. Yeah.
Thank you for very interesting. I think, in particular, I think that you nailed Ramus and what he was saying. I wasn't quite sure what you meant, though, when you said Palm celebrated Ramus.
I'm happy to be corrected on that point if you see it differently. I mean, I think his analysis of Ramus is because he sees the move from scholastic rhetoric to the method of reason as useful for the development of rational thought going forward. Okay. Well, again, I'm happy to be corrected. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'm happy to hear that and happy to stand corrected on that point. Again, I think the discussion of Ramus as a model of a certain kind of a way of thinking, right? And again, I was really just taking that from Ong, but I'm happy to stand corrected on that point. So I will change that going forward and celebrate that as a, no, I'm serious, you know. I mean, I'm not anti-rational, right? I'm not against reason. I'm only interested in understanding the limits of the claims of reason as either explanatory or, you know, sufficient. Yeah, okay, great, good. Yeah.
Okay. I have no idea.
Yeah.
It's a prop. So when you talk about the stochastic and compare it with the generative of Lull, could you consider some of the contexts of Lull, of some of the types of mapping that were going on at his time, such as the Portland chart, which was an accumulative, and I would argue stochastic in this argument, and also if you consider things such as pilgrimage maps, such as Matthew Parrish's and such. Is this so clearly differentiated, is what I want to ask in many ways. Because, I mean, looking at Lull's work and talking about it as generative contemplative, it evolves out of a social system which was much more accumulative, and I guess we'll use this word, stochastic. Do you want to work with that at all?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, first of all, let me just be sure, and I'm not suggesting you said this, but just be sure everybody understands. I'm not suggesting these are historically successive models, right? They exist. You know, Heraclitus is the touchstone, really, for thinking about stochastic processes. And I think as soon as you understand the interpolation of the subject as a feedback loop that's essential to any kind of mediating system, you're already in a realm where to explain that process fully, you are in the realm of stochastic and emergent conditions, right? But I guess the question I would have, and I'm not sure I'm sufficiently informed to answer it, is whether or not the sense of where knowledge resides in Lull's system is as fully codependent in the way that it works as I would suggest the stochastic intra-relational is. That I would still think that Lull posits a kind of external, condition of that which can be known, even if the process of knowing is crucial to that mediating condition. I don't know what do you think? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I would suggest are, shall we say, less structured and much more cumulative and much more what we would call socially mediated. Mm-hmm. Well, again, yeah, I guess the issue here is that, yes, they are highly socially mediated, but honestly, I've looked and looked and looked at the history of diagrams and maps. It's very interesting. Weather, the depiction of weather in particular, is very interesting to watch Descartes and Da Vinci looking at stochastic systems, right, and trying to model them and to think about how do you draw them, how do you represent them, what are the principles organizing these phenomena in the world that they can observe. The social as a mediating system, I don't see anybody modeling that in that period. Yeah. No, it's all. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'll pursue it. Yeah. But yeah, I just want to say again that I think the pre-Cartesian is a really important place for us to be looking to think about where we're going ahead. And again, because reason got such and it goes back to the first gentleman's comments, reason got such a grip on truth claims that we forgot that it was only useful for describing certain kinds of things. And it doesn't explain certainly most of how we live, how we experience, right? And not to say we're irrational, but rather that, it's irrational. It's outside of reason's capacity for explanation. So, if you want to talk about a quantum effect, talk about love, mysterious effects at a distance. It's a strong mediating force. right? And it's really, really interesting to think about, right? So, yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, very intriguing, challenging, and fun as well. When you speak of the social as the primary medium, with the emphasis on the primary medium, and the stochastic and emergent conditions that follow, I want a little more. I think I may be with you, or I may be sort of into nonsense here, but I want to grasp the ontological implications of what you're saying. I think you're suggesting them, but I'm sort of tripping to catch up.
Sure. Okay. Fair enough. I mean, I think I can explain it in a fairly straightforward way, which is to say that when we consider, and I'll take a slight detour to explain this, and to say that one of the areas of current critical thought that I find limiting and objectionable, this is what gets me into trouble, saying things like this in public, is the notion of media specificity. All right, there's this kind of notion that if you just like do enough, if you know enough about a medium, it will explain how it works, right? So it's like, I have students coming to me all the time and say, well, they want to know like what typeface this was and what paper something is printed on and so on and so forth. I said, you can figure that out, but it's not really going to tell you anything, right? In a sense that, the workings of a media object, right? The workings of it, the way it works with its, production of meaning is hermeneutic, right? It has to do with human beings. It has to do with, what we bring to it, what we know, how we understand it, the conditions of its, that it's the fundamental notion that, reception is production. Right? We know this, right? It's like, how many times does Stanley Fish have to ask us, is there a text in this room, right, to understand that reception is production, that the inherent characteristics of any media artifact are only sufficient to explain the specific inherent characteristics of the media artifact, right? They might tell us something about the bell curve around which interpretation would cluster, right? There'll be a normative interpretation of any media artifact within reason, right? And that's again, that's the sociology of hermeneutics, all right? So, but if we are to imagine that the media can be talked about as if they are, rather than to talk about media as always within this condition of production, then we are missing most of the equation. So when I say the social is the primary medium, it is to introduce that concept that, if to talk about media as artifacts or systems and so forth is the flatland. It's the flatland. It's insufficient. And I'm not saying anybody in this room would do that. I think, everything I've heard in the last few days is all about the kind of social inscription and the complexities of values, of ethics, of conditions, of the way in which media are understood. But if I shift that statement and don't say how media are understood, right, because that's still putting media at the center of our objective of our inquiry as if it's an object, and say it's not an object. It can't be an object by definition if we take this structure of the intra-relational rather than the interrelational. If we say there is not, an object out there and a person in here, right, that has this, but it's a system, right? It's a full stochastic system, right, of codependencies, of intra-relations in which the act of meaning production is a kind of, flattening of the wave function moment in that larger system. And again, it's like, oh, duh, of course, right? I mean, the social is the system. It is the system of in which these workings work. And so that's the more I can give you. Does it make sense? Good. All right. Yeah, it's the shift from flatland. I had a slide of flatland, and I was going to make the flatland point. But I was afraid I might go on too long, and I really wanted to leave, since it was a little dense, I wanted to leave room for conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was very stimulating. I think one of the ways to maybe raise the question about the ambiguity of the three categories, and I can't remember, it was declarative and then meditative and then stochastic.
Sure.
I think of something, in the way that the social seems to be playing in a historical context would be something like Rodin's The Thinker. See, when I show Rodin's The Thinker to students and I say, is this a classical piece or is this a modern piece, they'll have a tendency to think it's a classical piece, because they think of reason as something that's happening in the mind. But when you say, no, that's really the sensibilities and the orientations that were groomed out of the printing press. And the ancients, they would have thought reason was two people pointing at each other arguing, right? And so it seems as if the actual image of the thinker, it could be seen at a certain point that it was trying to be either meditative or diagrammatic, but it subtly influences subsequent generations to be, if it was simply trying to be diagrammatic, or if it was trying to be just descriptive, it ends up getting caught in the stochastic process of the evolution of consciousness according to various media, but it's also like a register of the way that people now, whether they intended to think about thinking in a certain way as something isolated in the head or rather than something dialogue, it subtly has that side effect.
So let me ask you a question in response to that. No, give him the microphone because I'm going to give him a thought experiment. See what he comes up with. He's a clever fellow. I bet he'll have an interesting thought. So what if I say to you that to take, if we were going to like create a sculpture out here, right, that was going to embody my notion of the social and the stochastic, and I gave it a slightly different title from your Rodin, right? Here's your thought experiment. The thinking. How would you show the thinking? Not the thinker.
Am I an ancient, a modern, or a medieval?
I don't care what mode you use, but so, again, if it's the thinking, right, and that's the shift I'm trying to make. It's like, you know, the thinker, the notion of the autonomous self, even with an interior life, the idea of the subject as an object of its own thought, sort of self-perceiving itself, even that is still within a kind of, you know, a rational construct. And the thinking is the fully dynamic process, the codependent relation. So it's like, how do we, and I'll let you off the hook. You don't have to come up with that sculpture right now. You have 10 minutes. I can't resist. You know, I mean, I think, can I just suggest you might channel your inner Nicholas Tesla for this, and Mesmer, get Mesmer and Tesla to help you with your statue production.
Would you agree with, you know, would you agree with the claim that something like, but I think to me it makes sense that the ancients, is how far back you go, the ancients saw thought as something that was atmospheric.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
in the environment. That
Yeah.
they were participating
Yeah.
in something like the gods in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Whereas it slowly
Yeah.
became part of dialogue, and then slowly it became inside the head. And that's an effect or a side effect of dominant communication technology.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring us back to the atmosphere.
But it's the social. I mean, I think
Yeah,
there's a social.
it's
there's
the
a
social.
hermeneutic element
Yeah.
in all of this.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just trying to revive that earlier belief system with the sense that it has a very strong, you know, sort of explanatory power as well as analytic usefulness for us to understand. I go back to the event with Kenny. It's such an amazing and powerful, destructive event. I mean, you cannot, anybody here know that event besides me? Okay, so it's had a huge destruction. Can I even tell you the scale of eventness that has unfolded? But what's happened in the course of the mediating communication of that event is that the original event space, with all of its complexity and, you know, full circle of, you know, dimensionality to it, is gone. Completely and totally absent from the way in which the larger socially mediated media network activity has occurred. And so it just got me thinking about, like, the absence at the center of this event is crucial for rethinking and in some ways saving a community from destruction around, you know, this explosion. So, you know, there's a lot there in terms of the, you know, kind of how, and we see this played out every day in terms of, you know, the way in which events that are media-produced events that have a social dimension, that social dimension gets lost in the mediation process. And, you know, our attempts at recovering are always recuperative and partial and fragmentary and, you know, second, you know, and so how do we work with this as a culture, right? To think about what we're doing in thinking about where the place of the social is within those mediating processes. So I think that's the other side of this for me. It's like if we can't think that, then we won't get beyond, like, taking the symptom for the condition, right? So to me, you know, that's a symptom, right? This is a process. and the difference between those is really important for what we look at and how we think about what we're looking at. So I'm not disagreeing you. I'm just going back to the atmosphere, I think. So is there another question?
I have a simple question. I was wondering, what's the relative merit of thinking of the social as a medium as against the thinking of the social as an ecology? I was alluding to Felix Guattari's 3 ecologies, which includes the mental ecology, the natural ecology, and the social ecology. And here we are dealing with media ecology, which transforms all of those 3. Because if we speak of the social as an ecology, that might be less confusing in a way. Just curious what your response is. Thanks.
Absolutely. I would completely accept that and say to talk about the social as an ecology is exactly the right thing to do. But I would say, I'm talking about medium as an ecology. And I had that word in my talk, and then I took it out because this is the Media Ecology Association. And I thought, well, I don't want to seem like I'm just, sucking up to you. So I thought I'll use other vocabulary, but I would absolutely agree with you, and also because the concept of an ecology has within it all of those nonlinear stochastic processes and the complexities of co-determined, codependent relations. So yes, absolutely, and it also takes us away from thinking of any kind of metaphor of a single unified homogeneous medium as a space or whatever. Instead, it is this domain of continually shifting vectors and conditions and, the locations and so forth of change. So I would absolutely agree with you. Thank you.
Kia ora, Johanna. Just a quick question is, would you accept McLuhan's tetrad as the dynamic representation of the drama of cognition?
I'm sorry, I didn't. Could you say it again?
Would you accept McLuhan's tetrad as the dynamic representation of the drama of cognition as the answer, the sculpture that would actually work for your thought experiment?
Oof, that looks to me like a great big trapdoor I'm not going to put my foot into. There's no answer I can make to that question in this circumstance that will not get me into trouble one way or another. So I am going to take the fifth on that one. So.
Hi, thank you for your comments. I wanted to throw out one thing in this move that you're making. I want to perhaps make the argument that Steve Duck has helped move interpersonal communication in the same way, where he wanted people to stop talking about relationships and start talking about relating, to stop looking at individual behaviors, but rather to look at these larger dynamics, which of course are embedded within these larger ecologies and these larger communities. If I were to put a sculpture out that represented thinking, it would not be static.
Right.
My issue with this is that it's one picture, and of course I know if we had all the zibby zabby, I would have stuff going. I would have things both going in and coming out.
Of course.
Right? An open system where people could throw in their trash. Right.
This is not meant to. This stands for a dynamic system. Absolutely. Yeah. Completely. Yes, but no, and again, I think it's what you're pointing to is again one of the places where this change of the way that we think is so crucial for dealing with real world problems, right? Because as long as you think about relationships as this and that, doing this, you're missing the point, which is it's a system. And again, every therapist I've ever known will say, if you can't talk about a member of the family outside the family because it's a system. And, it's all relational. It's all shifting, all changing all the time. It's why I object so much to these kinds of diagrams. I mean, I don't know any relationship I have where there's an edge that stays stable between me and another node. Right? It's like it just doesn't, right? It's always in flux. So absolutely. I was jokingly saying in a talk I gave recently that I want to write a very short book that's titled -ing. And that, if we just shift into the participle mode, then the procedural, the processual, the kind of dynamic flux aspect of the conditions of being become the way that we approach our, the way that we phrase our inquiries and our critical thought. So I couldn't agree more. Right. The verbing. All right. I'm calling it the inging. So, all right.
Anybody?
The great cogito of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. I guess also there's a question as to whether or not that was I am thinking, therefore I'm being. But what I wanted to mention was I was thinking, what would that statue be outside? And what would represent being in the moment? And I was thinking, well, environment, one thing that's immediate in terms of environmental representation is a sundial. It's there, it's fixed, but it's always changing and representative of the larger environment we're in. No. So
I think we need a holographic sundial that's kind of, charged with a kind of interactive aspect. So its own self-constitution as a temporal framework is dependent upon the, many clock speeds of the interior lives of the persons around it. And, again, it's like we all know we have fast days and slow days, right? You have days you get up and it's like, by the time you sort of brush your teeth, oh my God, it's 9:30, right? And other days when you get up and it's like, you brush your teeth, you even floss, you make your coffee, you talk to the cat, you write 2 or 3 chapters of your novel, you look at your watch, oh, it's only 6:15. So, time goes at different flow rates. So my only problem with the sundial, again, is the kind of fixity of a metric, even if it's even if it works with the relative conditions of atmosphere, is that if instead the sundial were produced as an effect rather than there a priori, then we begin to get at that codependence. So, but
Chronos versus Kairos.
Yeah. So, it's a design problem. We've got something to sketch over lunch, so it'll be good.
Thank you, though. It was great. Thank you.
And thank you all.